Okay, so I've got a special video for you today. This is a little fun project I was working on that ended up completely blowing up in my face. I bought a busted old Chromebook from someone off of Craigslist that they slammed in their car door, and I was going to use it as a desktop computer, and I was going to try to put it inside of an NES, and this includes the whole conversion process. Unfortunately, it fell apart on me piece by piece, which you'll see in this video. Now, I do have plans to use some of these parts separately for some other projects that you'll probably see later, but unfortunately it did have to get shelved, so I figured I would post this video for you guys to enjoy watching me fail miserably. Enjoy! So as you can see, here's my NES shell, already taken apart. And this is a little USB wireless keyboard that I plan to use as a controller. Here's the actual Chromebook itself, as well as my precision toolkit. Look at that shattered screen. She shut that in the car door quite hard. So my plan now is I'm going to go around and basically remove all the screws and rip this whole thing apart. I got my little tray up top to keep better track of my screws. The ones that are already in there are from the NES itself. These things are kind of a pain in the butt to get out. I had to tap it a little bit. Here to remove the remaining screws, I got to get under the foot pads. As you can see, I'm pointing out the screws here. This is a HP Chromebook G5, I believe. So I got it pried apart, and I had to remove the ribbon cables for the front panel with the keyboard and the touchpad. That ribbon cable right there goes to the power light, I believe, and the side port USB, which I'm going to use that later. Now I'm trying to remove the motherboard, and that right there is the battery. Just kind of trying to feel around and see what's going to move and if I've got all the screws. I did manage to get the battery out, which is sizably bigger than the rest of it. That is the left and right front speakers now trying to remove. Had no intentions of doing anything with those, but looks like there's a couple screws that I missed to get pieces off the board. I think that's the Wi-Fi and Bluetooth chip. Yeah, those are the Wi-Fi antennas, which end up wrapping around the upper part of the monitor, which you'll see later. The Wi-Fi chip is out. Now I'm fiddling with the actual power connector into the motherboard. There's also usually a weighted magnet to keep some heft on the unit. That cable right there removed is the connector to the video, the screen up top, up and above. And then this little guy that I just pulled out, I wasn't sure what it was at first, but I believe that is the open sensor that detects when the laptop has been opened and causes the screen to light up. So I managed to get the motherboard out. Now just removing accessory pieces to the unit, the actual hinges themselves, so I can get them separated. As you can see, that power block is still in there. I kind of got to pry it out. Looking around for any remaining pieces, anything else I can salvage from the board before I toss it. now it's time to separate the screen and see what I can salvage out of there, or what's necessary, things like the Wi-Fi antenna, possibly the webcam if it's functional. Really the goal is to just rip this thing apart all the way down to its core and then see what I have and how I can use it inside of the actual NES unit. Got to be super careful when you're dealing with something like this because of the sheer amount of shattered glass. It was very, very easy for me to cut myself. So I'm using a small electronics pry tool to get some of these clips and components apart, which I have. I've done a lot of work on cell phones in the past. So it looks like there was a couple screws under here, which is why I couldn't get it pried apart. Voila! The screws removed, screen comes off. Now the back of here I'm trying to salvage, again, those Wi-Fi cables. That's going to be important to have that. The webcam not so much, but the Wi-Fi is definitely essential to keep the antennas built in. Peeling back this tape to try to find connections to ribbon cables and tape down wires. You've got to be really, really careful with this stuff not to rip anything or tear anything. Even the slightest thing accidentally can ruin the entire thing. So it's also very important with after removing that screen to make sure I clean up my workspace. There was a lot of shattered glass. It doesn't show very well how much it was because it is glass and it's clear, but there was a lot of glass all over the workspace. So here I'm removing the actual hinges from the unit, just bare minimum so I can get the Wi-Fi cable out and maybe try to recycle the metal. The Wi-Fi usually funnels all the way around the outside of the screen up to the top near where the webcam is. There's usually two antennas or two wires connected to the Wi-Fi antenna. Not really sure why, but gotta make sure you get both. And then I've got the tape as well that kind of helps down. And I'm just connecting it together so that it doesn't wear thin or wear off. Just connecting it to a piece of plastic to keep it for later. Sorry, a little bit of lag in my video there. Not sure what happened, but I can't re-record it now. Usually most webcams or small pieces like this are just held in by like adhesive double-sided sticky tape, so luckily for me it came off pretty easily. If not, I would have used a heat gun. And that's it. That's the plastic top, pretty marked up, but it's garbage really. So over to the NES. As you can see, I've already got it apart, but now I'm screwing with the controller ports. What my intention was to reuse the controller ports and utilize a NES input on them, which is something I can link in the bottom. I actually made one, but here I'm sizing up the motherboard. Kind of jumping around a little bit because I wasn't really sure where to start, so I back to this is the keyboard and the back side of the touchpad, trying to remove those. Part of the reason for this is On a Chromebook, there is usually no external power button. The power button on the Chromebook is mounted specifically to the keyboard in the upper right-hand corner. So in order to use the button on the NES to power on everything, I would have to tap into or solder into the connection on the keyboard. Since it is a laptop, the keyboard is built into this frame structure. So here I'm ripping everything apart, and these are all little tiny rivets that each time I stick the screwdriver under there, it pops up and they fly all over, little plastic pieces. I'm still finding them to this day. Mind you, this project was probably about 3 months ago from when I recorded the video to now when I'm recording the audio. But these pieces flew everywhere. I mean, everywhere. Also got to make sure I'm not damaging the ribbon cable, because that ribbon cable does have to be connected so I can use that power button. I wouldn't use anything else on the keyboard, because that's why I've got that controller that I showed at the beginning. There's individual rivets on the keyboard itself here, which you can see I'm prying apart. And also you can see there's missing keys too, so this keyboard's useless. But here I'm actually prying off the key for the power button in the upper right hand corner. And I pull apart the actual unit. You can see there I have it folded back. It's like a flexible keyboard. So now I'm checking the Vibraton keyboard electronic controller to see if it has the same functionality, if I can use anything like a power button on there to make it work. So now I'm trying to pry this even further apart. I want to be able to really get access to that electric touch point. I'm also peeling the entire top layer off because in order to reset, which is another button on the NES that I wanted to use on the Chromebook, I would have to hold the power button, and I believe F4, maybe F3, and that does a reset on a Chromebook. So the goal is to solder a point to the power connection in the upper right, as well as for the power specifically, and then another connection that would tap the power in the upper right and the F3 button at the same time, so that I could trigger a traditional reset on the NES. But first, gotta get that whole thing apart, which involves clicking off, breaking, snapping all of these pieces, the keyboard, spacebar, all of them. And these hurt. Some of these snapped and they would hit my fingers because I don't have little tiny fingers, and it's hard to do this with a tweezer because you don't want to damage that flexible cable underneath, so you have to keep it pinned down. I don't know if you can see right there at the right side of the screen on the wood, the little red mark. You can see on my hands, I actually cut my hand open on my right side middle finger, prying this apart. I don't think I realized it until after I got this metal thing off, but yep, there it is. You can see the blood right in my finger. So now I'm jumping over to a different part of the project. I really wanted to use the controller ports on the front of the NES. However, obviously, unless you're plugging in an NES controller, they're not fully functional. I have USB to NES controllers that I wanted to use. So if you see that little red box in the lower left-hand corner, that is a 3D printed NES port. So I'm going to use a USB extension cable, a male to female cable, and I'm going to mount the female cable inside of that NES port. So basically I could plug in USB controllers like you were plugging in NES controllers, or any USB controller could be manually plugged in to keep that feel of an NES. But in order to do that, I have to rip apart current existing USB cables. So I salvaged a couple cables we no longer use at work and basically cut all of the rubber off of them to get it slimmer so I could slip it through these NES ports in order to make it fit tight. Did put a little bit of electrical tape on it just to make sure, because it's hard to do this without making little errors and possibly nicking the wires, so you have to be very, very careful. Also have to be very careful not to cut yourself. These things are super glued on there. They're very, very tight. So as you can see, even with the video sped up 4 times, it takes me a little while to get this thing apart and start getting pieces of it off. Also want to make sure I'm extra careful not to put excess pressure on that blade, because if something slips, and it has happened to me before where I've just pushed the blade too hard because you can't get through and you end up nicking your finger. Finally starting to make some progress on this thing. Plastic on this guy is super dense. Sorry, my big bald head in the way makes it hard to see. This was very, very frustrating. As you can see, there's like almost 20 different marks on it from angles I was trying to attack it at without having to cut the actual wire. That's the worst case scenario. If you nick that wire or you cut that USB wire, then the whole thing is beyond salvaging. Now, it's almost a shame because even though this project did end up being a failure, this part of it will be salvaged and used for other things. So, as you can see here, I'm kind of feeding the wire into that little 3D printed section to see if it'll fit or how it will work. And now, because I did nick the wire a little bit, I'm electrically taping it so it doesn't get further damaged. Tidying everything up real nice. I'll come back to that after everything else gets all set. Then you got to make sure you vacuum everything and clear everything out. Wanted to make sure I didn't have stuff that was too big that would get jammed in the vacuum. So now I'm over onto my cutting board just because it's easier to see and keep everything separate. These are those little red pieces I told you I 3D printed, and I'm fitting them into the actual NES unit itself. And I can post those in the description of the 3D printed pieces I made to basically convert the unit into a self-contained PC where there's no weird looking holes on the back, don't have anything going in or out of them. Plus you can also drill into any 3D printed material. Just kind of shaving up the unit a little bit because sometimes 3D print has a little bit extra filament. Kind of rounding the edges a little bit too. But it fits in there pretty good, and like I said, I did make these publicly available on Thingiverse, so if anybody wants to use front port USB or rear port audio, video, power, basically blocker holes, they're publicly available. And I did hot glue them in order to keep it down so they wouldn't move. I've also got a 4-port USB hub that I no longer use that I'm going to cut apart and use, because if you're connecting the Chromebook, there's only one or two, I think, USB ports, and they're not directly in line, so using a USB hub would be the best option. Over down into the left side of the screen, you've got the reset and power switch from the actual NES, which I was referencing earlier. Want to make sure you don't use too much hot glue, otherwise it'll look awful and take up way too much space. But in this case, since it is just plastic to plastic, hot glue is probably going to be the best option. It worked pretty well, all things considered. Still holding up now. So now I am cracking out the soldering station. So I always recommend to have a temperature controlled solder station because they do make your job so much easier. You can tell it exactly where you want it to be for the type of solder that you're using, plus you can get smaller, finer tips and have a bit more precision, a lot more temperature control. Got a couple different things that I want to tackle here in terms of soldering. I mentioned earlier about that keyboard, but one of the things I also wanted to do is I wanted to use this chip right here, which has a little tiny LED on it. I wanted to connect that LED to the LED on the actual NES and have it power it when it turns on. So in order to do that, I have to remove the LED on this little chipset board and then find a way to connect it to the NES itself. Now, as far as this video goes, I'm doing the best I can so you guys can see it, but there's a little tiny circle at the top part of my Helping Hands kit that's helping me see more zoomed in, and it's a little off focus for you guys. The angling is kind of weird, but the actual piece itself is right next to that headphone jack. And it's a flat mount LED. It's very tiny. So I'm going to put some flux on it to help me loosen it up once I get it heated, and my plan is to just push that little LED off the board. I was told by a couple people who are way more savvy with soldering than I that this would be a very difficult task in terms of getting this piece off due to it being a flush mount, a top mount solder piece. So I'm just tinning my soldering iron here to make it easier. There's the little LED. And you'll see it actually came off pretty quick. Came off really quick, pretty easy. Much easier than I was expecting it to. So now there's two flush mount open panels that I need to connect to my LED on the NES. So I've got a little bit of wire here. Obviously one for a negative, one for a positive. And I'm going to cut some off and use it to mount to the board, because that board is not going to be right next to where the NES is. There's no way to make it work. you have to extend it out with wire. This, again, was another thing that I was told would be incredibly difficult by well-seasoned soldering people I know who use solder all the time, much more experienced than I. But I figured no better way to learn than to try. So I'm sizing out my wire, trying to figure out how much to give myself, how much to cut, how much to strip. Again, I'm sorry you can't really see it here on the video, but this is so fine-tuned that in order to be able to see it in the video, I wouldn't be able to see it. So I'm pre-tinning the actual cable, and it actually took really, really well to the board. So the next step is to prep the other cable, because you have to have a positive and a negative. So I'm pre-tinning. Trying to make sure there's a gap so that the two wires don't connect and short circuit. As you can see, I used my little razor blade, my X-Acto knife, to make sure of that. And again, the cable actually stuck quite well. I think it did a pretty good job. But unfortunately, this is where the project started to go downhill. So as you can see, the red cable is no longer connected when I just brought it back up there, and I'm looking at it up close. The red cable pulled off the board. Now, hopefully it was just a matter of the solder coming off the board, but it was not. The solder didn't come off where it was connected. The actual flat panel chip came off of the LED. button connects those two layers together. So I'm scratching the spots that I need with a little X-Acto knife to make the wire or the electrical conductors exposed. And now I'm going to use my helping hands to keep this piece apart so that I can get in there with my soldering iron and make the connections from the power cable into that keyboard button. And this is where the project goes completely off the rails. First, the LED did not work, easy fix, but here, as you can see, I zoom in and I slow the video down. I have to bridge one cable to each part of this connection. So I try to do the rear connection right here with the solder. And you can see me looking in because I'm wondering what exactly is happening. The solder burns right through the flexible cable. Completely through it. So the pad is now gone. So I'm trying to see maybe if I can get any solder to stick on it at all. Maybe anywhere in there, like further down. But the temperature of the solder is just too high. Look at that. It fell right through the flexible cable. So I'm debating trying to make it touch on the other side, but look at the size of the hole up there. This connection is officially shot. There's no way to connect any electrical cable to this keyboard, which means I cannot use the buttons, any buttons on the keyboards to function any buttons on the NES, the power, the reset, anything like that. At this point, the project is a complete failure.